CIA was accumulating all this information about the Soviets controlling US POWs and taking them away. This is just another example. There were dozens of these, probably hundreds in total. You're looking at them here. So back in 1989, when you saw the Pentagon was saying that there was no evidence that any POWs had been taken to the Soviet Union, I went to the Eisenhower National Library, and I found a document which was entitled, and I basically had to blow the dust off it, Read US POWs in USSR. I took it to the front and said, can you show me this document? Because the Pentagon says none of this happened. And the nice man said, well, sir, you can fill out this form and we'll get back to you in a few years. Which I did. But I had a friend inside the government, and I sent the form to him. And he had not known about this, but he called me back up and he said, Sauter, you want to find out about this, you got to find an old, retired lieutenant colonel of intelligence called Phil Corso. And I found Phil Corso. I called him up. He said, I've been waiting for someone to call me all these years. I was in charge of POWs in the Eisenhower White House. The document that you're trying to get that's still classified is from a defector, Yuri Rosparov, who told us that Soviets took POWs to Russia. But we already knew that from many other intelligence sources. And I said, Colonel, are you saying that the Eisenhower White House knew that they took our POWs in Korea? He said, Eisenhower himself knew. I briefed him. We couldn't get them back. We knew they were going to use them for intelligence purposes and would deny it. And we decided it wasn't worth creating more friction in the relationship we had with the Soviets. So I started fighting even harder to get this document declassified. Ultimately, it went up to the National Security Advisor to Bush President #1, Brent Scowcroft, who was also involved in the Vietnam POW issue, and Charlotte knows it. He wrote a letter ordering the government to keep this document secret. This is a document that's 5 years older than I am, which basically says the Soviets took our POWs, which the Pentagon and White House at that time said never happened. Years later, after that, the document was finally released. There it is. Okay. This is the Rosparov document. During this whole time it was classified, the government was saying that that old colonel had made it up. It wasn't true. Well, guess what? It finally gets declassified, and it says, interview with Rosparov. And look whose name is at the bottom. Anyone read that? Corso, C-O-R-S-O. He was telling the truth the whole time. Rosparov said he was told by recent arrivals Rosparov had defected in Japan, who's KGB, that the KGB had US POWs, they were screening them, they were going to train them to be illegal residents, meaning they were going to take the POWs and break them down psychologically, give them new identities and send them back against us, maybe in Canada or Australia, or they would take Zimmerly, and I would be teamed with him as a KGB agent, and I would learn everything about Zimmerly, then they'd shoot Zimmerly, I would go with the Zimmerly passport. Selected POWs would be used in propaganda, and then they say, preparing legends for new Soviet agents. The mechanism for POW control was headed by the Soviets. Oh, surprise, that's a document I just showed you that said that the POW head was the Soviets. By the way, this is the stuff the government still says doesn't exist. So that was the Rosparov file. During this whole time, we still continued getting a lot of information about POWs shipped to Russia, much more. Norm can talk about that. Overwhelming amount of information. I sent a Freedom of Information Act request to the CIA after Rosparov died. He was on the CIA payroll for decades. So the guy who gave that information was working for the CIA. Ultimately, he was asked to testify to the Senate, and he claimed he didn't know nothing, that this document really didn't exist. He was a liar. 2 other CIA guys said, yeah, Rosparov told us about this. So when Rosparov died, I went to him, and generally, if someone's dead, you can get the information from them. The CIA refused to give me the information. In fact, the CIA refused to admit they had files on this KGB defector. Even though, when he defected, they took him to the State Department 5 miles from here and had an international press conference with him. So I wondered, why are they still hiding the information from Rosparov, who, by the way, lived only a few miles from where my family lives and was alive when I was, even when we were living there and I didn't know. Well, earlier this year, I found this document. If you look at it, you'll see that it says almost exactly the same as this one. This is the White House. This was kept secret another 20 years after this one came out. So because we made a big splash and Corso said this existed, they declassified it, they kept this one secret. It's only been released in the last year. I don't think anyone else has seen it. But if you notice, it essentially says exactly the same thing. White House, CIA report. This CIA report was put out about a month after Ross Perot defected. I believe that what happened was Ross Perot gave this information, and this document was sent around the world to American intelligence saying the Soviets have our POWs. Then, if you look at the dates, a year later he was dragged to the White House where he said the same thing. But here's the intriguing part. Ross Perot told, and by the way, for John Clark and Mr. Hall, the CIA lied to the Senate and the Pentagon saying they had no information on Korean War POWs. Those records were released in your lawsuit. I have them and can show them to you. So during this time, the CIA had all these files on this defector. They had the defector alive here in Washington. And when the Senate said to them, do you guys know in the Senate investigation about POWs taken to Russia? The CIA said, no, we have no files on that. When the Pentagon, the predecessor of the Norms Group, Task Force Russia, said to the CIA, do you have anything on POWs taken to Russia? The CIA said, no, we don't. They lied to the Pentagon, they lied to the Senate. The whole time they were sitting on this document, which they never released to the Senate or the Pentagon. Now, my question is, why did the CIA go to such a big effort to hide the files on this man? Why do they still hide it? I just tried to get it again. I'm fighting now for a mandatory declassification review. Why are they fighting to hide this? I have an opinion on that. You'll notice here when Ross Perot went to the White House, he said that he was told by recent arrivals from the Soviet Union that the Soviets had taken our POWs to Siberia, which, by the way, was totally illegal, would have been an act of war. I did some research on Ross Perot. What was he an expert on before he defected in Japan? He was an expert on taking Japanese POWs, turning them into communists, and returning them to Japan. He was in Japan running his agents that he had brainwashed in Siberia. He was an expert on brainwashing POWs. Notice what it says in his remark to the White House. In essence, the Soviets are going to brainwash Americans and use them. So it made me wonder, did Ross Perot really say, oh, I heard this happened? Or did he know more about it than he admitted? Turns out, a woman who was in the POW camps in Korea, civilian, stated that she had met Ross Perot in the camp with American POWs in Korea. I found an old guy, Shorty, who's one of the last surviving POWs from Korea from this era, and described this to him, and he said, that's probably Blondie, the KGB agent who was hanging around our camp. What I believe happened was this KGB agent didn't hear about this from other people. He was an expert in brainwashing and using Japanese POWs. They brought the American POWs to the same camps right by the Japanese POWs. He was in charge of taking our POWs, our loved ones, our heroes, and turning them into agents and sending them to their deaths in the Gulag. And the CIA knows this and has kept it secret all these years and lied to the Senate and lied to the Pentagon and lied to you because they were covering up for a man that they were paying all these years who sent our heroes on a one-way ticket to Siberia. And swear to God, I will find out the truth about this before I die. Norm, you're up.
All of that.
Well, good afternoon.
I hope I'm not upsetting the apple cart too much if I talk to you from here. I can see more of you that way, and I'll make sure to glance your way as well, Artie, so don't worry, I have not abandoned you. When you spend 18 years of your life in pursuit of an issue, as I did, you like to think that you've established something of an understanding of what goes on, whom you can rely on, who you can turn to if there's something that doesn't square with other things you've acquired through the work you've done, through your cooperation with other people. In other words, you've become comfortable with where you are, what you know, and what you can tell those whom you serve, which are the families. I wish I could tell you that I have that confidence in those 18 years to live at that, for me personally, but I cannot. I do not see a program in place that's gone forward at all in establishing trust with you, nor do I think the underpinnings of such a program are in place. The fact that the Central Intelligence Agency does not share information is nothing new. After all, it's not called the Central Disclosure Agency. Those folks operate on the basis of obvious secrecy and the principle that it's much easier to suck up information than recover it after you've released it. So the tendency is to give as little as possible. And for me and the others who work this issue as, let's call us intermediaries between you, the public, and the intelligence community, we understand full strength what it means to get out and to try to be forthcoming with you, and at the same time respect the oath we took, the affidavits we signed not to disclose information that would harm national security. We walk a fine line. The line can often be distorted. I can give you an example of a case, a Cold War loss case in July of 1959 over Soviet waters in the far east of the Soviet Union, where a good bit of the information that we acquired had to do with intercepts from Soviet ships in the area. And the information was the property of or collected by the National Security Agency, or as they call themselves, no such agency. In any event, we made absolutely no headway at all in trying to access that information. They wouldn't share it. A senator weighed in and they blew him off also. So I tried to explore on the margins what it is that we might be able to do to get some portion of the information released and made available to the family. And we invited NSA over to the office for a discussion. After months of wrangling with them, the fact that they agreed to come over suddenly resolved many of the points in conflict with us. And the only thing that they would not agree to was the information that was acquired from submarines. Anything that they intercepted having to do with submarines in the area, they would not disclose. Everything else in the transcript of information that U.S. military capabilities intercepted from Soviet sources was released. Suddenly, it was 10, 12 pages of higher than top secret information that suddenly became available both to the applicant or the ones who submitted the request, the family member, and by the way, to the Russians as well, because once we were able to get the information declassified, we presented it to the Russian side of the commission and said, here, this is what we know about the intercepts or the communication between your ships at the time of the incident. Can you look further into the deck logs and so forth and tell us what your naval assets picked up at the time of that crash. We never heard back from them, but it provided us a source of information, and it also showed me fairly early on in my work that the whole question of the sensitivity of classified information is not ironclad. There are obviously things that fall within categories that no one in his right mind would think of sharing because of that sensitivity, of the concern it would have for national security. But there's a fair amount of material out there that is simply rubber stamped as not accessible without any legitimate explanation. And it's that which I believe that we, and I put myself in that category as though I'm still in the system and in the Defense Department working issues, have a right to pursue, to secure the release of for you, the families, and for you, the public, in some form. And if we're not doing that, we're not doing our jobs properly. Mark talked about the word substantiated, to use a term that DPAA invokes to explain why it is that the information that has been acquired over the years is not credible. It's not credible because it's not substantiated. The reason, for the most part, it's not substantiated is because it's not substantiatable, meaning to substantiate it to the satisfaction of outfits like DPAA would involve having the Russians cooperate with us in making the information available from secret archives that are still inaccessible, that we can't get anywhere near, or talking to people who are directly involved in the decisions. Now, to invoke this word, the term not substantiated, is also to dodge the responsibilities you were given to investigate the information. No one said that this information would be handed out to you, but no one gave you a pass on trying to get to the bottom of it and establish some basis for arriving at conclusions. Let me bring up, since it involves Charlotte directly, the question of what we came to know as the Doden Memoirs. Benjamin Doden was in internal exile in the Soviet Union for much of his life. He ran afoul of the system. His parents were in the camps and the like. He had relatives here in the States. And as a young man, he was convinced that at one point, the United States and the Soviet Union would be involved in a military clash. And he wanted to find out as much as he possibly could about his relatives here in the unhappy event that they should be sent over to the Soviet Union for a military conflict. So Doden collected information extensively over the time that he was in the Soviet Union. Somehow, he managed to get out of the Soviet Union about the time the country collapsed, a year or so before the collapse in 1991, and he came to Israel. He was Jewish. There, he approached the U.S. consulate in Jerusalem with what's come to be known as the memoirs. These are accounts, second, third, fourth-hand accounts, snippets of information that he garnered from a variety of sources, addressing the question of Americans who were on Soviet soil, those who were captured, those who were in the camps, wherever they might be. That information was passed to the military attaché, ours, in Jerusalem, and it was sent through channels to the IA here in Poland. Accompanying that information was a classified cable discussing the general contours of the discussion that the defense attaché had with Doden and summarizing this material. I got the cable through standard channels, but I didn't see the accompanying information. So I asked around. I said, what happened to all of this material that Doden bases the discussion on? Well, we don't know where it is. What do you mean you don't know where it is? You classified this information. If you can't find the information, you're guilty of a security breach.
And this is when you were a high official in the Pentagon, just to be
Well,
clear, or the JCSD. So
I
just
was-
in place where you were.
Well, that's charitable to call me high. I can tell you, I didn't see myself that way, and very few of the people I locked arms with saw me that way. But anyway, I asked for those documents out of curiosity, and no one could produce them. Absolutely no one. I went to DIA, I went up the chain in OSD, no one could. So I said, look, first I'm going to call for a security investigation because a breach has occurred here. And secondly, if you all aren't going to help me get a hold of Doden, the hell with you, I'll get a hold of him myself, which is what I did. I got the consulate in Jerusalem to check Israeli phone books and locate Benjamin Doden. And within a few months after we got his coordinates, we got a call from the consulate saying that we'd like to speak to him. And in the summer of 1990, it was 99, I guess, a couple of us went over to Jerusalem with people from the embassy. This wasn't a rogue operation in any sense. And we sat down with Benjamin Doden, and you can imagine the look on his face when we asked him for duplicate copies of what he had already provided. I mean, to give you an idea that the impression the United States government put in his head of our efficiency and reliability.
And commitment to the issue by losing the documents
Yes,
that he had risked his life to bring to you.
Yeah, so there we are. We got the documents and thanked them, and came back, at which point I translated them into English, and there were copies made available, and the Russian version, as well as the English translation, had his name deleted. Not because Doden particularly cared, but because the Israelis didn't want to start up with the Russians and cause any sort of diplomatic row, so they asked us to take his name out. In the fall of that year, 1999, we had a meeting in Moscow with the Russians, at which point the U.S. chair of the commission, Roland Machoy, a two-star Army general, retired, presented these materials, the memoirs. And that kicked off quite a controversy over there, and the knee-jerk reaction, especially from the intelligence community, was this is provocation, this is just an attempt to poke us in the nose or stick our fingers in their eyes, whatever it was, and that was that. So this was the initial Russian reaction, fully expected. But we persisted, and by the way, well, I'll get to that point in a second. We persisted with them, and in the meetings that we had, particularly on the Korean War, I said to the Russian chairman of the Korean War Working Group, you know, the American public is not going to let this go. The fact that you all don't think that this is credible information does absolutely nothing to assure the American public and the families that it is, in fact, not credible. So I have a proposal for you. My proposal is that we agree to a joint investigative probe, because the memoirs, in addition to referring to individual loss incidents, also cite specific...
Referring to Charlotte, just to be clear, Charlotte's brother, Sam, right there on the right with the hat, where it was in the memoirs that you had to go get because the Pentagon lost them and you had to go get them again.
That's correct. Major Bush there, Samuel Bush, was in the crew of June 1952 aircraft downing that's mentioned among the others. Let's work together, I said to Captain Bartanov, the Russian counterpart. Let's see if we can go and launch a genuine effort to visit the specific sites in the Soviet Union where Doden in the memoirs mentioned that Americans were seen, Americans were routed through, whatever it might be. We would identify those spots, and the U.S., the Russians would establish the logistics, and the U.S., as was generally the case, would cover the finances involved. But we would launch it as a bilateral effort to show that the Commission was in business and we helped each other to resolve these issues. Well, the Russians bought into that. If you read those remaining minutes of these meetings that DPAA has not taken off its website, which I'll talk about momentarily, you'll see that you can follow that discussion. You see that the Russians responded favorably to the idea. The ones who did not respond favorably to that idea were right here in Crystal City, the home of the enlightened, my leadership. And why was that? Well, it's expensive. Of course, money to launch a program like this, and we could use that money to redo our files. Or maybe we could launch a useless project looking into the Chinese archives that has produced absolutely zero, except a boondoggle every now and then over to Beijing for the leadership of the office, but certainly nothing that we would be prepared to fund for you and your chasing who knows what in the remote areas of Russia. Never came to anything. Never came to anything, and the result was we never were able to run it again. Now, why do I mention it at all? Because that would have been an example of something that we could substantiate. We could come back from a trip like that with some degree of data, whether accurate or otherwise, that would allow us to give some credibility and value to these memoirs. And that wasn't shut down or stopped by the Russians. That was stopped right here in town by our lovely blue team. I'm using red and blue in the conventional military sense, no politics intended here. So nothing came of it, and when you look at the whole experience of operating in an environment as the one that I had to function in for those 18 years, it's really not hard to paint the picture of why nothing did get substantiated. The Doden papers used to be, or memoirs, used to be part and parcel of the website, the DPMO, the previous organization, when the DPAA renamed. That used to be on their website. You will look in vain, and absolutely in vain, for any reference to Doden or his memoirs in the current holdings on DPAA's website. The only place you'll find it, by the way, is in the Alliance's collection of material on the POW research. I would recommend to you that you take a moment and read through those 12 pages or so of material and how fascinating that is. And by the way, where we could bounce the material off of what Doden said in those documents, we did. And we found in each instance there was sufficient information to regard those comments by Doden as credible. He talked about someone from World War II. He talked about a group of people who were in the camps in Russia during the Korean War period with names that were given. Many of those names track with those listed as unaccounted for in the Korean War. So unless you're a true conspiracy theorist and believe that Doden did nothing more than manipulate data for the sake of creating an impression, you have an example here of how the U.S. government has consistently failed to follow through. And that's not simply the question of deception or lying or withholding, which you might try to defend on security concerns. There's nothing of the kind here. It's another dimension of a program that's doomed to failure unless people on the outside raise their voices and insist that the U.S. government take this seriously. Marx am I okay to refer to what you got from
Sure.
EPAA? Mark's statement here, twice that he got as a responses. JCSD, meaning the Joint Commission Support Director, has found no substantiated evidence that POWs were taken into the former Soviet Union. Well, guess what? The Russians themselves have found and told us about information attesting to the fact that American POWs were taken into the Soviet Union. The Russians have pointed that out. But our own government, the people who are charged with looking at these issues and coming up with accurate information, don't know about it. There were any number of cases, starting with World War II, even earlier, where we had pilots who were down. They were taken captive. These are pilots in the East in a war against Japan who landed on Soviet territory. They were captured by the Soviets. They were held in captivity. And then they, months later, were quietly released, generally across the Soviet border with Iran. But they were held. They were held. There was, in fact, a book written about it. So for someone who supposedly is in the know to come out with absolutely erroneous information and with a straight face, put it in a piece of paper that he presumably knows full well is going to be going to a wide audience, is frankly an embarrassment. Frankly, on a personal level, someone lacking self-respect would do that without checking. I want to commend to you, if you have a moment, there's a book here that was put out by a British scholar, Tim Tsouliadis. In fact, Tsouliadis called it Forsaken, an American Tragedy in Stalin's Russia. This book chronicles, time and time again, instances where Americans, both civilian and military, were taken into the Soviet Union and abandoned. The U.S. government did zero to help get them out. And at least some of the work that we did on the commission, identifying these so-called unsubstantiated instances, appear right here in Tsouliadis' book. If you have, the thing came out in 2008, Penguin Press in New York. I'll leave it here if you want to get the title. It's nicely written, and it's extremely informative, and of course it totally disproves and discredits the assertion that the Russians did not take Americans or hold them there for intelligence purposes. So if the U.S. government is not prepared to go beyond saying that information is unsubstantiated, not make a good faith effort to substantiate, they're basically, or whoever pursues these sorts of animals, is deceiving you and the American public overall. There are, you could say, how much time are you going to in today's climate with Russia, you could argue that it's never been as bad, that the overall relationship is at rock bottom, and yet the commission, at least in theory, exists. Next month, 20th or so of June, the Russian side of this commission is coming over here to Washington for another plenary session. They'll meet, they'll talk about their various groups, their various issues. I don't know if any of you are aware of that event. That's another point for you to take up with the EPAA to see if you can get an invitation there, because I understand that this part of the proceedings will involve a chance for the public to meet with the membership of the commission and let them know of your concerns. I remember when this used to be a standard part of the agenda that we would have people come over from the family. Charlotte was present and spoke to your beloved friend, about the urgency and the importance of pursuing the work, of doing more, of not sitting back and relaxing. Because You can't avoid the impression that what we have now is a caretaker regime. There's nothing going on, and everyone can conveniently hide behind this facade that, well, how can you possibly expect anything positive out of the relationship with Russia? Look at everything else going on. Look at Crimea, look at Europe, look at Syria. You know what? This issue is supposed to transcend politics. The Russians, when they meet with us, say, politics is politics. This is an issue that we work together on for a humanitarian purpose, and we're not abandoning it. We want to continue with it. So that's a bogus line to pursue. If they pursue it, I don't know. I'm just saying that even if everything falls apart, you have the opportunity to use the commission as a vehicle for pursuing unresolved issues. If DPAA would finally restore to its website all the past minutes of meetings in years past, you could have a running history of a chronology of everything that's been done, and you could read from that what we tried to do and where we are today, and you could understand, I think, why someone who put faith in the work of the commission is disappointed. But you cannot allow the commission to sit and continue to atrophy. Things need to happen, and they're not going to be generated from within the government, either our government and certainly not their government. There are many other things which can and should be done to examine the question of how one substantiates information. There's a whole series of documents called Ringer reports. Ringer reports were compiled by the U.S. Air Force right after the end of World War II, and they were intended really to serve as targeting information in the event that there was a strike against the Soviet Union by the West.